What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. The extraordinarily long life of Jimmy Carter has come to an end. Former President James Earl Carter passed away today, confirmed by his family to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Washington Post. The longest-lived American president was 100 years old. Born James Earl Carter Jr. in Plains, Georgia, on October 1st, 1924, the first president born in a hospital, the Democrat pursued state politics before he was elected to one term in the White House, where he served as the nation's 39th president between 1977 and 1981. Carter's mother was a nurse, and his father was a businessman and farmer who grew peanuts, cotton, sugar, and corn. The National Park Service currently oversees the Carter family farm as part of the Jimmy Carter National Historic Park, where it is open to visitors. Carter attended public school in his hometown before enrolling in Georgia Southwestern College and the Georgia Institute of Technology. He ultimately graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1946 and served as an officer in the U.S. Navy for 7 years. Once his time at the academy was accomplished and completed, he married one Rosalind Smith, who later became the First Lady during Carter's term in office. The couple had 3 sons and 1 daughter and would be married for 77 years, the longest marriage in presidential history, surpassing the marriage of George H.W. Bush and Barbara Bush, who were married for 73 years. Carter first decided to pursue a career in politics in the early 1960s when he was elected to the Georgia Senate. He launched his first gubernatorial campaign ahead of the 1966 election and lost, but went on to win his second bid for governor 4 years later, becoming the state's 76th elected leader, and served from January 1971 through January 1975. Carter was one of the first new Southern governors who advocated civil rights and reform in that area. After a brief time overseeing the DNC, Carter announced his intention to run for president in late 1974. At the time, he was not a widely known figure. As a matter of fact, it was 1973. Oddly, it was just yesterday. I was watching a clip of Jimmy Carter on What's My Line from 1973. He was not known. And at the time, 1974, 1975, it was thought that the contenders for the Democratic presidential nomination would be people like maybe George McGovern, who just ran in 72, Hubert Humphrey, Ted Kennedy, although he was damaged by Chappaquiddick, of course. His name was there. Obviously, so maybe somebody like, what's his name? I'm trying to think of the senator strong on defense from Washington. What is his name? Name eludes me right now. I know it begins with an S. But anyway, it was thought that these individuals would be in the running for the nomination. But Jimmy Carter, who ran a very strong primary campaign, was able to win the Democratic nomination. And it was a favorable time for a Democrat. This was after Watergate. This was after the nation was put through the trauma of Watergate under the Nixon administration. Gerald Ford, who was initially popular because of his reputation for being an honest politician and have bipartisan support from Republicans and Democrats alike, quickly growing popular because of his decision to pardon Richard Nixon just a month into his presidency in September 1974. That compounded with inflation and rising well, I guess that's the inflation. But matter of fact, it got so bad a new term started to be used, stagflation, which was a combination, if I remember correctly, my economics, that's a combination of stagnant wages and inflation. Uh, and Jimmy Carter was able to defeat Gerald Ford with an electoral college vote of 297 to Ford's 240. One elector in the state of Washington, I believe, voted for Ronald Reagan, who almost won a nomination from Gerald Ford in 1976. Walter Mondale, who passed away in 2021, was Jimmy Carter's vice president, one of the great vice presidents in the history of this country. While President Carter was credited with encouraging a peace agreement in the Middle East that ultimately resulted in the Camp David Accords, which the Office of the Historian at the U.S. the Department of State described as historic. The White House archives list the Panama Canal treaties and an agreement between the U.S. and the Soviet Union restricting nuclear weapon production as one of Carter's biggest victories overseas. In the U.S., Carter pursued deregulation in a handful of industries, including energy and transportation, and pushed for new environmental protections. The U.S. Department of Education also launched during his time in office. Carter's presidency is often remembered by the Iran hostage crisis and struggles at home as the U.S. faced an economic downturn. A White House Historical Association overview of Carter's administration credited hostage crisis, which continued for more than a year and didn't end until Carter's final day as president, with impacting the Democrats' unsuccessful bid for re-election. Carter lost the 1980 election in a landslide, winning only 41% of the popular vote and just 49 electoral college votes. Republican Ronald Reagan won 51% of the vote, captured 44 states to Carter's 6 states in D.C., and 489 electoral college votes. The independent candidate that year, John Anderson, a liberal Republican, yes, there used to be such thing a liberal Republican, won about 6% of the vote, and it's believed he hurt Carter more than he hurt Ronald Reagan. Shortly after leaving the White House, Carter established the Carter Center in Atlanta with his wife and in collaboration with Emory University. The former First Lady was Carter's full partner in their efforts at the nonprofit that was continuing her work by chairing its mental health task force as of January, according to her co-founder page on the organization's website. And it's generally believed that Jimmy Carter, who was not the greatest president, I think that's the consensus, did have the most successful post-presidency of all time. It lasted the longest, some 43 years. And his organization did a lot of good. A lot of good. In 2002, Jimmy Carter won the Nobel Peace Prize for his decades of untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development. And you may recall that his organization and his efforts, maybe his greatest achievement, was the elimination of the guinea worm in Africa. And Jimmy Carter, sometimes to the ire of the president, because sometimes they saw him acting as an unofficial Secretary of State, but his humanitarian efforts were well known throughout the last 40 years. He often crisscrossed the world and often third world regimes advocating democracy. And I vividly remember when I was in middle school, I think it was in late June of 1994. Jimmy Carter visited North Korea when the president at the time was Kim Il-sung, and there was belief that Kim Il-sung, the longtime leader of North Korea, would abandon his nuclear weapons program. But conveniently, shortly thereafter, was Kim Il-sung died. Kim Jong-il became president or leader or dictator, more or less, of North Korea. And whatever hopes that North Korea would begin to open up its country and perhaps begin to abandon its nuclear aspirations were terminated. Jimmy Carter, I think, on the balance, was one of the good men who became president. And you could say a lot of bad things happened during his presidency. But I'll tell you this: when Jimmy Carter was president, homelessness was way down. That began to skyrocket when Ronald Reagan became president. I'm convinced if Jimmy Carter was president, the HIV epidemic would have never happened if Jimmy Carter was president. When Jimmy Carter was president, there was more of a balance between the rich and the poor. And he was right about a lot of things. We didn't want to hear it. But when he made the so-called Malay speech, he was being honest. He was keeping it 100. Americans have become greedy. Americans don't want to ever hear their leaders tell them we might need to sacrifice. Because Jimmy Carter wanted to be a moral leader. We claim that we want our politicians to be more moral. I'm not saying we need to have a preacher in the White House, but when he tried to display or show moral leadership, we didn't want to hear it. And here we are so many years later, and look at the state of Washington, look at the state of our leaders. It's been a real huge decline from the days of Jimmy Carter. But anyway, the longest lived American president, Jimmy Carter, has passed away at the age of 100. A long, magnificent life has come to an end. Tell me what you guys think.